I'm an archaeologist. Some would call me an overeducated ditch digger, but it's a very interesting field. A lot of people don't seem to know exactly what it is. A lot of people think I dig up dinosaurs. I really like dinosaurs, but that's not what I do. Or they think I run around and look inside of volcanoes. I don't do that either. Archaeology, it's about people. So if I was going to define archaeology, well, actually there are many definitions of archaeology. That's one of those things, that academics do. They discuss the very meaning of the subject they're supposed to already know about, or the very definition of it. So there's a lot of it. I mean, one of my, some say it is the study of the human the study of the material remains of the human past. Okay, so that's what you're left over with. You're actually studying the residues of what people used to do. You're studying their garbage, essentially. But it's more than that, especially if you work in a place like Egypt. So just to say it's the study of the material remains of the human past, in a place like Egypt, there are inscriptions that can actually give you a peek into the way people think. So it's well beyond just studying and measuring a rock or an ancient temple or something. It's more than that. But one of my favorite definitions is from an Israeli archaeologist named Anson Rainey. And he says, archaeology is the science of digging a hole and the art of telling a tale. And I think that sums it up quite well, because there is an art to revealing the past, and then there's an art to interpreting the past as well. I find it very curious that the world's most famous archaeologist is a cartoon figure. Probably heard of Indiana Jones. I mean, can anyone else name another archaeologist? Maybe Howard Carter, who found King Tut's tomb 90 years ago. And ever since the early 80s, it's been Indiana Jones. Complete cartoon, actually a very, very, not a good archaeologist at all. If you watch the movies, as an archaeologist, you cringe, but I look at it as fun and adventure. The story I've heard was that the original character's name was to be Smith, and that Indiana was the name of George Lucas's dog. So it's all made up. And I often get asked, they say, archaeology, is it just like Indiana Jones? To which my response is, I said, yeah, it's just like that. Let me show you the scars on my chest from where I've been drugged behind a Jeep by Nazis. So anyway, my early interest in this sort of stuff did start with dinosaurs. And I do like them, and the Pacific Science Center has some very nice things with dinosaurs. I also was kind of a bookworm. As a child, I loved reading National Geographics, and it was a project of my father and myself to try and collect every one of those magazines from beginning to end, and I really enjoyed them. And a young man can learn many good things from National Geographic, and I did. And there are articles about Egypt, and it was always my favorite to read the articles about ancient Egypt. And then also I read a book that my father gave me called Kon-Tiki, written by a Norwegian explorer named Thor Heyerdahl. And you can ask me about this later. I'm going to talk mostly about Egypt tonight, but I used to pretend I was Thor Heyerdahl when I was a little kid, and then 20 years later, I ended up being his right-hand man and working with him as his right-hand man the last 7 years of his life. So anyway, I always had an interest in Egypt and the Valley of the Kings in particular, and part of it was sparked by the original King Tut exhibition that came to Seattle in 1978. There's probably a number of people in this room who saw that. It was spectacular. They had the gold mask. They had all kinds of objects, different objects than in the exhibition they have today. It was outstanding, sort of inspirational thing for me. It really brought back to me why I really enjoyed this subject. I was almost finished with a degree in political science, which I did finish, but I changed majors in graduate school and ended up studying archaeology, with one of my areas being Egyptian archaeology. So archaeology is always very popular. It's on TV all the time. There's dozens of different things on it. But Egypt seems to be the most popular kind of archaeology. You might ask why. Well, part of it's an essentially extinct culture, which is intriguing in many ways. These big temples and mummies and and these sort of things. The writing is kind of interesting. The hieroglyphs are fascinating. The religion is curious. And also, it's very old. I mean, when you look at things like the Great Pyramid, this massive structure, 2 million blocks of stone expertly arranged, that was built around 4,600 years ago. That pyramid was so old, the Greeks and Romans would come to Egypt as tourists to look at the old stuff. And it's true. You can find Greek and Roman graffiti all over these sites, and they are tourists marveling at the sites of ancient Egypt. So it's very old. Also, the preservation is excellent in certain parts of Egypt, especially in the south. This stuff survives really well. So that's why you can have intact burials like that of Tutankhamun that are in splendid condition. And out of that, you can see that the craftsmanship is superb. It's almost mind-boggling in some examples. So you go to that Tut exhibition at the Pacific Science Center, you'll see some stuff in there. I was just there this morning, and it's really, every time I look at it, like, you can't take it for granted. You see the detail and such, and it's amazing. And I think part of it has to do that the more technologically sophisticated we become, the more incredulous we are that anybody could have done anything in the past without a laptop and a cell phone. When in fact, 4,600 years ago, they were building these massive pyramids that were not just piles of stones, but they were exquisite piles of stones with interior chambers and such, and doing amazing artistic things. So, yes, they could build a pyramid without a laptop. And many of you here, I don't consider myself that old, but when I grew up, none of this stuff was around. There's no cell phones, laptops, CD players, iPods, and you can go down the list. And people did just fine. They even sent a man to the moon. So you're using not much of just a fraction of the technology that we have. And also, it's so startling because it's old that it also inspires a lot of interesting things you can ask me about during the Q&A things, like aliens. If you can't understand something, you can say it came from outer space. That happens a lot. The whole series on TV called Ancient Aliens. It's all about, if you can't understand it, it's another proof of aliens. And then there's also things about curses. That's another thing you might want to ask me about when we do the Q&A. Curse of King Tut. The Egyptians are going to put a curse on you, and it's going to kill you and everyone you know. So anyway, as I mentioned, I changed majors in graduate school and ended up doing mostly Egyptian archaeology. I ended up going to Egypt my first summer in graduate school with my professor, working not on pyramids and tombs, but on what we call Egyptian prehistory. Because the tombs and the gold and everything gets all the attention. But the pyramids didn't appear out of nothing. There was a process involved that took place over thousands and thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years, where they're just hunters and gatherers wandering around the Nile Valley, hunting animals. And then agriculture came to Egypt, and from that foundation, you developed what archaeologists would call a civilization. Well, I'm going to move on and talk specifically now about the Valley of the Kings. I'm not going to go into great detail on the timeline of Egyptian history, other than saying the Old Kingdom, this is when the big pyramids were built. So the Great Pyramid itself, about 2600 BC. Egypt, divided into two parts. They call this the Nile Delta, or Lower Egypt, and then the Nile Valley, or Upper Egypt. And a lot of the action during the early part of Egypt, Egyptian civilization was here. It's based out of Memphis, and that's where you have the Great Pyramids of Giza, all these great pyramids and such. So here you are. This is a picture of the Great Pyramid. It used to have smooth sides, absolutely smooth, sparkling, beautifully polished limestone sides. But they, in years since, it makes a great quarry for building stones or building palaces and such in Cairo. But it's still an incredible thing. It's about 480 feet tall. And there are a bunch of them there in Egypt. None that's big, but there's a lot of them. Egyptologists generally believe they were used as the burial places for the Egyptian rulers who were considered to be living gods on earth. This is what most pyramids look like in Egypt today. They're a mess. After the Great Pyramid, pyramids got smaller, And this too was faced with smooth limestone, beautiful blocks, but then again quarried away. Well, in terms of these successfully being royal burial places, they're utterly unsuccessful because there's been not a single intact pyramid burial ever found in Egypt. So they're a disaster. And some might say that you can see these pyramids from 10 miles away or maybe even further. It's an advertisement that says "rob me" all over it. And that's what happened to most of them. So during the later time period, what we call the New Kingdom, from about 1500 to 1000 BC, the Egyptians adopted another strategy for building tombs for their divine rulers. And that's the New Kingdom dynasties 18 through 20, and it's in the south. So there we go, Valley of the Kings right here. We call it the Valley of the Kings. And this is what it looks like, more or less, today. It's a remote valley. Instead of being out there in the middle where everybody can see it from miles and miles around, it's a secret valley. The rock is primarily limestone, and tombs can be carved in that. And above it is a natural mountain that appears in the shape of a pyramid. And most Egyptologists seem to think that's one of the reasons this site was chosen, because you have a pyramid that has great symbolic meaning to it, and below it a valley that's conducive for the building of royal tombs, and easily guarded, and not very well known. You try and keep it more or less a secret. Again, here's a view of it looking down. The Nile River is off in the distance here, so it's fairly remote from where the general population lived. And so into the walls and little canyons of the Valley of the Kings were carved these tombs. So here's a map of the Valley of the Kings. There are over 60 tombs in the Valley of the Kings and in a valley, adjacent valley, many of them which are royal, sort of a who's who of the Egyptian New Kingdom. The royal tombs tend to be elaborately decorated and include typically a big stone sarcophagus or box for holding the coffins and mummies. And some of these are in pretty good shape. Some of them aren't. But that's typical royal tombs, beautifully painted and carved into the limestone as in tunnels. Well, this went on for about 500 years. In about 1000 BC, the New Kingdom, well, I can't say it went away. There's a political change in Egypt, and the Valley of the Kings was abandoned. They stopped burying the rulers of Egypt there. In fact, the tombs were being robbed. Most of the tombs were robbed, and priests would come and collect the royal mummies, which had been stripped for their jewelry, and then hid them in certain places. And I'll get to that in just a moment. So it remained abandoned, and some of those tombs, their doors were wide open for centuries and centuries and centuries. You can find Greek and Roman graffiti in there. There's evidence that some Christian monks used to go and, meditate in these tombs. An abandoned, remote desert valley. This is a drawing from a European visitor to the Valley of the Kings in the 1700s. And you can see the pyramid-shaped mountain up here, and then lots of holes in the sides of the valley. Most scholars will date the beginning of the field of Egyptology to 1798 when Napoleon invaded Egypt, because he brought not only his army, but he brought a whole group of scholars who came to study Egypt, and artists who came to draw the remains. They couldn't read the hieroglyphs. They really didn't understand this stuff, but they did a really good job of documenting it, and including the Valley of the Kings. And so this is a very early map, a map done by Napoleon's scholars of the Valley of the Kings. And it's really important because you can see which tombs were open and which ones weren't, and where tombs would later be discovered. The first archaeologist, I won't even call him archaeologist because it's sort of proto-archaeologist, antiquarian, was an Italian named Giovanni Belzoni, who started excavating the Valley of the Kings around 1816, 1817. Very curious background. He was a circus performer. An Italian circus performer did a strongman act in a magic show, mostly in Britain, and got lured to Egypt. It's a whole story. It's a whole lecture on its own. But he ended up in Egypt. He was a very large man, and he had some sort of background in engineering and became a specialist in moving large objects that eventually made their way to the British Museum. He also discovered a number of tombs in the Valley of the Kings, including one of the largest, the tomb of Seti I, and had the sort of astuteness to have an artist with him, and he was also artistic himself, to document the paintings in these tombs and the hieroglyphs, even though they couldn't read the hieroglyphs at that time. And these are really important, too, because some of these tombs have been so severely damaged. These and the records of Napoleon's artist are some of the only clues to what the place looked like before it got damaged in the 19th century. He did very good work. For an Italian circus performer, he did brilliant work. Here you can see a nice archaeological, I think a plan of archaeological quality up here, and then a brilliant cross-section of this particular tomb. I mentioned those mummies that had been buried and collected around 1000 BC by the priests. Most of those were discovered in the late 1800s, including a secret cache on the other side of the cliffs from the Valley of the Kings. And it's right behind this rock, right here, a deep shaft. And it was in somebody else's tomb. They put over 40 royal mummies. And the local people who were robbing tombs, some of the local people, were pilfering it gradually over a period. They found it 10 years before, and eventually its location was revealed to the authorities, and it was a who's who of the Egyptian New Kingdom, including guys like this, Seti I. And you can see the notes of the people who restored the mummy on here. They all say, we found this guy's tomb, and it was a wreck, and his mummy was all stripped, and we took him, we rewrapped him, and we put him in someone else's tomb, and then it'll say later we moved him so-and-so. So you have a whole record of these priests moving these mummies around, and eventually storing them in a secret place that wasn't discovered until the late 1800s. Here's the mummy of Ramses II. It's extraordinary. Looks like the guy's taking a nap. And then on his coffin, it has his name, and then the inscriptions of the priests talking about how they moved the mummies around. And then there was a second cache found in the Valley of the Kings itself that contained a number of other mummies. And you can see they were originally beautifully wrapped, but then the robbers, they know that they're in their wrappings. There's jewelry. There's jewelries on the mummies, rings, amulets, all kinds of wonderful things. We know this because of what was found on the mummy of King Tut as a surviving example of an intact burial. Just a couple other discoveries, and mostly in the 1800s. Loads of tombs. Several dozen tombs were found by archaeologists whose skills had developed since the time of Belzoni. This is a rather well-preserved mummy of someone who seems to be one of the best friends of a ruler. Here we have, in the early 1900s, we have an American millionaire named Theodore Davis who got permission to dig wherever he wanted in the Valley of the Kings, and he hired professional excavators, such as these two people here. These are British excavators. This is Theodore Davis here. And he liked to spend the winters in Egypt, living on a beautiful houseboat and supervising digs with his hired archaeologists. And he found amazing things. This particular tomb, if King Tut's tomb hadn't been found, this would probably be the big discovery in Egypt because it was treated that way. You've probably never heard of Yuya and Tuya. Yuya and Tuya were the parents-in-law, the mother and father-in-law of one of the great pharaohs, Amenhotep III. And as you can see, this is a plan of the tomb. Almost everything was in there. It had been robbed. People had messed around with the stuff. But it was almost all in there. And it was a sensation all over the world. But nothing compared to Tut's tomb. But at the time, it was amazing. Loads and loads of beautiful things, including gilded coffins and such. So this was the rage before Tut. But now, very few people have ever heard of Yuya and Tuya, unless you're an Egyptologist. They're good-looking people. I mean, for being dead and 3,500 years old. Few weird things in the valley. They found there's 3 tombs that had animals in them. And they're buried next in the vicinity of a tomb of a ruler named Amenhotep II. So people are thinking maybe these were his favorite pets. I mean, what are you doing burying animals in the royal cemetery? But there they are. There's also been some mystery tombs in the Valley of the Kings. This one I can do a whole lecture on too. It's called KV55. And some people think this could be the coffin or the remains of the burial of the famous heretic ruler, the strange religious cult named Akhenaten, who was probably the father of Tutankhamun. And right here is where the name of the ruler would have appeared in hieroglyphs, and it's completely carved out. That's one way to take down an ancient Egyptian. They believed that if you could keep someone's memory alive, including their name, that's one way they would survive forever. So if you want to send them into eternal nothingness, you go around and you chop their name off of every monument their name's on. And here, even on this coffin, someone chopped the name off. So this comes out of the Valley of the Kings. There's Akhenaten. There are objects from Akhenaten, again, probably Tut's father, in the exhibit at the Pacific Science Center. KV-62, 1922. I should mention what the KV stands for. There are a lot of tombs in Egypt. There are thousands of them. And there's a numbering system for them because we don't know to whom many of them belong. So KV means King's Valley. So when you see a KV, you know it comes from the Valley of the Kings. So KV-62 is the number that has been designated to the tomb of Tutankhamun. And it was discovered by an archaeologist, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter, who worked with an English member of the aristocracy named Lord Carnarvon. And Howard Carter actually began as an artist and later learned the skill of archaeology. It was Lord Carnarvon, paid for the dig. Actually, they're ready to give up digging in the Valley of the Kings because they weren't finding anything. And Howard Carter begged for one last field season and found Tut's tomb because there are clues. Tut was a very obscure historical figure. He's actually an interesting transitional figure, but in 1922, people may have heard of him, Egyptologists, but he's not a famous king. Now today, that's King Tut is known by everybody. Obscure historical figure. But he's famous because he's dead. That's what it comes down to. His tomb was discovered virtually intact, including with seals. You may not know this, but there's evidence the tomb might have been lightly robbed at least twice. And there's evidence that suggests that the robbers, at least on one occasion, might have been caught in the act. And then you have the steps leading down and a corridor leading to this room just full of royal burial material. Spectacular. The preservation's outstanding. Howard Carter worked in this tomb he finally did the last bit of work in there in 1932. So it took him almost 10 years of field seasons to be able to deal with all the material in the tomb. And here you can see another sealed door, and behind the sealed door were 4 nesting golden shrines, and at the center was a stone sarcophagus containing 3 nesting coffins and the intact royal mummy of Tutankhamun. Of course, this is the famous gold mask that was found on the mummy itself. So the mummy itself is very intact, and to this day, no matter what's found in an archaeological site around the world, it's always compared to King Tut's tomb. This is the most spectacular discovery since King Tut's tomb. They find something in China, it'll be compared to King Tut's tomb. So it's really hard to find something quite like it. I'm just going to talk just for a minute about my own work in the Valley of the Kings. I work on what are called undecorated tombs. So the Valley of the Kings is famous for these big royal tombs. But most people don't know that scattered amongst these big royal tombs are several dozen little tombs. They're just shafts, and sometimes it's only in one room. Some of these tombs were found 150 years ago, and the people who were looking for big royal tombs thought they were boring and covered them up, and they're never seen again. They were essentially lost. And so that's what intrigued me when I put together a project to work in the Valley of the Kings, and that's what I've excavated. So far, those are the tombs I have excavated. So here's a map of the Valley of the Kings. You see all those colors and dots. Those represent tombs in the valley. But the red dots there represent all the little undecorated tombs. So what's so special about the undecorated tombs? Not only were they ignored by previous Egyptologists, they have no decorations on the wall, which is kind of a mystery. So you can't just walk in there and read the walls and tell you who this person is that's buried. Who are these people so special to be buried in the Valley of the Kings amongst the royalty? We know some of them are favorite officials. Some of them are royal relatives like Yuya and Tuya. but it's a big mystery. So again, you can't just go in there and read the paintings, because there are no paintings. So these are the tombs that I decided to address, and I was pretty much the first one to go back and do that sort of thing. I'm going to tell you a little story. It's going to be a real little story, because you can read the rest in my book. Read the full details. It was my dream to work in the Valley of the Kings. I was intrigued by these undecorated tombs because there's very little known about them. No one had really, some of them had never been seen in 100 years. One in particular I was interested in. It was a long-lost tomb known as KV60. It had been found in 1903. The archaeologists looked in it, thought it was really boring, and walked away, and it got covered up and lost. We ended up finding this tomb in less than a half hour, our first day of work, using a broom. And it's an amazing tomb. You can see the steps there going down. And it's known as KV60. It's a very crudely carved tomb. It's got a corridor. The steps look like they've just been hacked out. The burial chamber's unfinished. Found the remains of smashed-up burial on the ground and a very provocative mummy in the foreground. Well, there was a famous Egyptologist who suggested that if this KV60 were ever to be rediscovered, perhaps the long-missing mummy of the famous female pharaoh Hatshepsut. There's a female who ruled Egypt during the New Kingdom. Very, very rare event and quite an extraordinary reign. No one had ever found her mummy. He said, maybe if this tomb were discovered, that mummy could be in there. And we rediscovered it, and sure enough, it looks like a royal mummy, royal female mummy of Hatshepsut. The Egyptians, just a few years ago, did a study. They took the mummy to Cairo and did some very interesting things I don't have time to describe, and were able to identify the mummy as indeed that of Hatshepsut. So that was quite a discovery for first day of work in the Valley of the Kings with a broomstick. Another a tomb that was completely buried and lost is known as Tomb 21. It was discovered by Belzoni in 1817, and this is his drawing of the plan of it. And we went in there, and it's extraordinary. No decoration on the wall whatsoever. And unfortunately, it had been damaged by flood water, but there's still a lot of stuff in there, including the remains of 2 female mummies. And if you look on the right, that is the mummified bent left arm of one of these mummies, and we believe that to be perhaps a royal pose. You saw that mummy that's been identified as Hatshepsut. It has the same pose. It has a bent left arm and a clenched left fist. So that's really controversial. These mummies look terrible because they've been exposed to flood water. But the Egyptians did DNA tests on these 2 mummies, among others, and they think that one of them, I don't even know which one it was, the one on the left or one on the right. They're both kind of a mess. They think could be related or the mother of one of the stillborn fetuses found in King Tut's tomb. Some of those little undecorated tombs that everybody thought was boring. In one tomb, half the size of this stage, undecorated walls, it's just a shaft in a single room, we found the remains of 13 individuals. These are all very special people. They're in the Valley of the Kings. And they're all young women, infants, or children. There's a story there that's got to be amazing. 13 people in one tomb in the Valley of the Kings. If you want to hear more about that, about my work in the Valley of the Kings, which is far more elaborate and far more exciting than what I just shared with you, I'll be doing one of these lectures. They're having a guest lecture series associated with the Tut exhibition. I'll have a slide of that in a moment. I'll be doing that on October 9th in Seattle, and I'll go through the whole thing about how we do our expedition and well illustrated and details about some of the things I just showed you. A couple other extraordinary discoveries. 1995, an American archaeologist named Kent Weeks was poking around in a tomb that was known for 100 years, but he decided to dig it out a little further, and he found a massive tomb. He still don't know how big it is because there's a lot of flood debris in it. He started here. Let me see. I think this is where he started. He started here, and they knew about this chamber here, and it was full of flood debris almost to the ceiling. And then they dug a little further, and it broke into this massive catacombs here that keep on going. There's things that go underneath in every which way. There's over 100 chambers. and it's thought to belong to the sons of Ramses II. Ramses II had many, many children. So that's a great discovery since 1922. 2006, a friend of mine, another American, Otto Schaden, he discovered a bizarre tomb in the Valley of the Kings. We call it KV63. You recall Tut's tomb was KV62. This is KV63, the first new tomb, so to speak, found in the Valley of the Kings since 1922. But is it a tomb? They opened this chamber, and it was intact. And inside of it were, I think there's 7 coffins in it. So everyone's excited. Until they open the coffins, there's no bodies inside. They're full of embalming materials, mummification materials. And then all these big white jars full of mummification materials. But some beautiful coffins, unfortunately in very poor state of preservation because termites got in there. And some of these coffins seem to be just held together by paint. And the wood is mostly eaten away. But an extraordinary discovery. And then just this year, actually, it started last year in 2011, a Swiss expedition working on undecorated tombs, sort of the way I do. They stumbled across a tomb that we now know as KV64. And they opened it in January. I was lucky to be there with a group of my PLU students when it was announced, and it belongs to the tomb of, I believe it's a temple singer, a female temple singer. So discoveries are still made. And I like to use these little quotes. This is Belzoni in 1817. It says, "In my firm opinion, in the valley there are no more tombs than are now known in consequence of my late discoveries." So Belzoni thought he'd found everything there was to be found. Dozens and dozens of tombs later, Theodore Davis, the American archaeologist, after having found many tombs, says, "I fear the Valley of the Tombs is now exhausted." Well, of course, I say nonsense. I mean, not only is there stuff there, such as these tombs we've been working on, but occasionally finding new things. I know places there, I'm not telling you where, I'm pretty sure the Valley of the Kings still has a lot of secrets. In fact, there's so much to learn just from the stuff we even know is already there. Well, I'm going to end this little talk, and then I think there's a little break. This is a book that people seem to like a lot. It's called Beneath the Sands of Egypt. It talks about some of my work in the Valley of the Kings and elsewhere in Egyptology. It talks about how I got involved in such. It actually begins with the rediscovery of Tomb 60. So you might like that. Another book that came out not long ago, people think is very fun and entertaining. This is part of a series of travel guides to ancient places. And this was written as if you were in Egypt in 1250 BC. How would you get in? How would you be treated? What would you eat? What would you see back then? And a lot of people think this is a fun book. I certainly do. And I got a website, too. You can find it at PLU. It's going to be expanded with more information about our excavations and so forth. Of course, if you want to see some wonderful objects from Egypt, including the Valley of the Kings and the Tomb of Tutankhamun, you can go to this TED exhibition at the Pacific Science Center running through January 6th. They are also hosting an Ancient Egypt Distinguished Speakers Lecture Series. There are, I think, 8 in October, maybe more. They're taking place almost every Tuesday in October and November. And they're bringing people in that know their business. The first one, October 2nd, great friend of mine, Nicholas Reeves, he's going to talk about Tutankhamun's gold mask, I think. And then there's this funny guy the following week. And then after that, someone who is one of the world's experts on the pyramids will be talking about his work in Egypt. So it's a really great lecture series. You can check it out. There's information on the web about who all the speakers are.